Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session of the MIT AI Conference 2020, AI for a Better World. Please welcome Andrew Lo, our professor at MIT Sloan, who will be discussing the question, can data science and financial engineering help cure cancer? Thank you, Andrew. Welcome here, and all yours.
All right, great. Thanks very much. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. And I also want to thank the MIT Club of Northern California for sponsoring this and inviting me to speak in such a distinguished group of other speakers. So I'm a relative newcomer to the field of healthcare. I got interested in that for personal reasons, friends and family dealing with various kinds of cancer. And one of the things that I realized about drug development is that we are in a very special period right now. The way that many people have put it is that we're at an inflection point. How do we know that? Well, because my MIT colleagues told me so. Susan Hockfield, Tyler Jacks, and Phil Sharp published a report a few years ago titled The Convergence of Life Sciences, Physical Sciences, and Engineering. And the idea behind this convergence is that there are breakthroughs happening faster than ever before and in a variety of different fields. And the way that they and others have characterized this is the omics revolution. Genomics, epigenomics, transcriptomics, all of the various different fields of biomedicine have seen some tremendous advances over the last few years, all except for one. The one omics that really hasn't changed as much as it probably should is economics. The idea that we actually have to pay for all of this stuff, and the business models that we're using are still very much the same as they were 10 and 20 years ago. But even that's changing. And that's what I want to talk about. It turns out that the main characteristic about drug development that poses a real challenge for investors and other stakeholders is risk. And I want to just illustrate to you very quickly how risky it is to develop a single drug. So imagine an investment that costs $200 million. It will take 10 years before you see any kind of rate of return. And the probability that you'll see any money out of this is 5%. How many of you here would be willing to take on such an investment? Now, every once in a while, I'll have a student who raises her hand and says, well, Professor Lo, you didn't tell us, what do we get in that 5% chance that we do succeed? Because most people look at this and say, $200 million, 10 years, 5% chance of success, no thank you, not interested. Well, it turns out that these are the back of the envelope numbers for what it takes to develop a single anti-cancer drug. And in the unlikely event that you are successful in that 5% chance, 1 out of 20, as the EARN illustrates, it turns out that a cancer drug is worth about $12.3 billion upon approval. Roughly, that's $2 billion a year in earnings from years 11 to 20, which is how long the patent life usually lasts. The first 10 years is clinical development. And so you get another 10 years of that $2 billion a year. And that amortizes to about $12.3 billion in year 10. So now that I've told you what you get, how many of you would be interested? I suspect still a pretty small number. And it's because although the rate of return is reasonably attractive, 12% compound growth over the first 10 years, the volatility is extraordinary, 423.5%. By way of background, the volatility of the S&P using the VIX as an indicator as of a few days ago is about 30%. So this is way too much risk that typical investors can possibly take on. So what's the solution? Well, it turns out that financial engineering can actually play a useful role. This idea of multiple shots on goal, if you took 150 of them and you put them into a portfolio, well, it turns out that actually the rate of return looks pretty good. In 150 shots on goal, each with a 5% probability of success, and if they're independent, it turns out that the likelihood of getting at least 3 successes is about 98%. Now, of course, it does take a lot of money to do this. What's 200 million times 150? That's $30 billion, and that's a big number to come up with. Does it really require $30 billion? And the answer is not always. It depends on the particular area that you're trying to develop. For example, in the area of rare diseases, which is a really interesting area because almost by definition, the shots on goal are independent, very low correlation among different rare disease therapeutics. It turns out that you don't need 30 billion, maybe a few hundred million will do. And the proof of concept is a company that was founded a few years ago by an MIT alum, Neil Kumar. I'm very proud of the fact that Neil took my finance class when he was at MIT. And BridgeBio Pharma is the company that he created. And today, 4.5 years after he started the company, it's worth about $3.5 billion. I urge you to take a look at the website and see the little video clip. I have a small cameo appearance there. I'm very proud to be one of the early investors of this remarkable company. So there's a lot that financial engineering can do, but I want to be a little bit more ambitious today. I want to talk about the possibility of using tools like machine learning to be able to change the odds from 5% to, I don't know, maybe 10, 15%. If there's a way that we can actually identify the things, the characteristics that make clinical trials more successful, or figure out what will make them less successful, we can then change the odds and be able to make the risk-reward trade-off that much more attractive to investors. And when it's more attractive to investors, more investors will come into the space. So last year, a student of mine, a couple of students of mine, Qinwei Xia and Chihim Wang, and I published a paper on applying machine learning to predicting clinical trial outcomes. Now, I know there are a lot of companies out there that are already doing machine learning-based drug discovery, companies like Atomwise, 23andMe, Benevolent AI, Helix, Deep Genomics, Color Genomics, all sorts of wonderful companies. But I'm focusing on applying machine learning not to design the molecular structure of these drugs, but rather to predict clinical trial outcomes, because that's what investors care about. And in this paper that we published in the Harvard Data Science Review, we find that using a large database of clinical trial data from Informa, a data vendor that we have an academic license with, we're actually able to predict clinical trial outcomes to some degree. Not perfectly by any means, but certainly better than random, and to the point where investors can actually use this information to make their investments and to be able to allocate their capital a little bit more efficiently. Now, I won't have time to get into the details of it, but I want to tell you about a current project that we're working on that extends this machine learning project. And you can all take a look at the data and the software. We have all of our software out on GitHub with an open source license. And it turns out that Nick Kelly from Novartis read our paper and approached us and asked, would we be willing to collaborate with Novartis to create a data science and AI challenge for their internal research teams? And the challenge that we came up with was pretty simple. Can Novartis teams beat us, namely beat our paper in terms of being able to forecast clinical trial outcomes? Now, of course, the expertise at Novartis is tremendous. They know a lot more about the underlying chemistry and biology of the disease. And so we would expect that they would, but we thought it'd be a really cool experiment to be able to use our data and our structure as the starting point and then allow them to bring their expertise. So we launched this data challenge in October of last year, 5 months, 50 teams, over 300 participants around the world, submitting over 3,000 different models to try to predict clinical trial outcomes using data provided by Informa. And the particular objective was to predict phase 2 to approval clinical trials. And the final presentation of the top teams happened just a couple of months ago. So the challenge setup was for us to be able to put our data infrastructure and the various different software that we used to be able to make our predictions and to allow the teams to take that as their starting point and obviously improve upon it in various different ways. And the idea behind using the phase 2 to approval period is this is a problem that many pharma companies actually face, where a drug is in phase 2 and based upon the results, they have to decide whether or not they should move it to phase 3 or kill the project. And so this was meant to be as realistic as possible using data from these companies. And I'm very happy to say that they succeeded in beating us. The top team actually increased the AUC almost by 0.1, which is pretty significant given that our level of the AUC, for those of you who are in the machine learning community, is already at the point of around 0.8. So we were doing a pretty decent job, but they were better. And part of the reason they were better is that they brought in tremendous domain-specific knowledge in addition to the data science elements. And so a couple of outcomes from this project is that they validated a number of the findings that we came up with in our paper, but they also came up with a number of new features, important features that could actually help investors do a better job of allocating capital. We're now in the process of preparing a research paper that will be published. The findings will be put out there for everybody to take a look at, and it'll be co-authored with Nick Kelly as well as all of the participants of the top two teams. And our hope is that this will actually encourage more people to get into the space and to be able to take these ideas and use them. So let me conclude by saying that we've had a war on cancer since 1971. And since I'm not a biomedical expert by any means, I'm not qualified to tell you whether we're winning or losing the war against cancer. But I can tell you as an economist that war is probably the wrong metaphor, because war is based upon hate and fear, and we can't live in that state for any length of time. A human will die if constantly exposed to hate and fear. Greed, on the other hand, is very sustainable. And so what I want to propose is, in addition to declaring war on cancer, maybe we also put a bounty on it. We use the financial system, we use data science and financial engineering to be able to do well by doing good, because finance does not have to be a zero-sum game if we don't let it. And if we all work together, I think we can actually do this now. So let me stop here. Thank you very much for your time, and would love to take any questions from those that are online, and turn it back to Fadi.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you for that. I love that last piece about focusing away from war and more towards greed. Thank you for that. We don't have any questions at this time, so if there's anything else you'd like to discuss, go ahead. Oh, actually, one just popped up. So a big shout out to Professor Lowe for his edX courses on science and finance of biotech, which they're thoroughly enjoying. So that was from Jan.
I really appreciate that. And by the way, that course is joint with Harvey Lodish, an amazing story that if you take the course, you'll find out about it. But it's free, and so we'd love to have more and more people learn about the science and business of biotech, and help deal with many of the diseases that currently don't have any therapies.
Awesome, thank you. Another question popped up from Anonymous. Data on rare disease is rare and distributed in closed silos. Thoughts on how rare disease therapeutics developments, do you have any thoughts on that, given that it is in silos?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. First of all, let me mention that for those who are not familiar with rare diseases, I think you probably all know about certain rare diseases like hemophilia or Duchenne muscular dystrophy, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. By definition, a rare disease is a disease that affects 200,000 patients or less. That was defined in a piece of legislation that was passed by Congress in 1983, the Orphan Drug Act. And it doesn't sound like rare diseases should be all that interesting or important until you realize that there are over 7,000 of them, and 30 million Americans suffer from one rare disease or another right now. So that's more than the number of people that have cancer. So this is a really big problem, even though it is siloed into these very, very small segments. One way to deal with that is to, first of all, use patients as a source of power in being able to get action. Specifically, patient advocacy groups, there are many of them for each disease. I'm currently working on one with a former student of mine whose son has Pitt-Hopkins syndrome. It turns out that there's a Pitt-Hopkins Research Foundation, run by parents and with amazing energy and commitment to being able to gather data among the various different patients, to be able to raise money to provide research dollars so that scientists can actually figure out what the underlying biology is. And eventually, once we understand enough about the science, that can get transferred over to the private sector where we can raise a fair amount of money to be able to make an investment. And as Neil Kumar from BridgeBio will tell you, investors did very well with BridgeBio Pharma, but most importantly, Bridge now has 21 projects in its portfolio, of which 3 are in phase 3 trials, which is remarkable for a company that's about 5 years old. So I think that the way that you can actually break down those silos, or at least be able to energize them, is to be able to engage parents and other patients involved, and to be able to bring those together with the private sector, with investors, so that they can actually turn this into a win-win for investors, for patients, for scientists, operators, entrepreneurs. Everybody wins.
Yeah, great points. Thank you. Another question from Anonymous: would game theory be a good basis to examine this problem, given the competitive interests?
That's a really good point. There is a certain amount of strategic interaction among the larger companies. The smaller ones are actually too small to really affect the landscape of market dynamics. However, what we've seen over the course of the last maybe 10 years is that more and more of the blockbuster drugs are actually being developed, not just by big pharma, but really by smaller biotech companies, and even in some cases by academic medicine. So I would say that game theory is important. There are a lot of strategic interactions, but I would say that maybe it's even simpler to focus on motivation on the part of investors. That, to me, right now is the biggest challenge, getting money into the early stages of drug discovery, what people usually call the valley of death. But certainly at the bigger levels of drug development, the big pharma level, you have a smaller number of players, and their interactions can be very important. So understanding the strategic component of the biopharma industry is critical.
Great, thank you. Scott Morrison asks, to what extent can the additional learnings from Novartis be built back into the LSW models?
Well, so one of the things that we learned from that Novartis challenge is that there's a lot of important expertise distributed across any ecosystem, and you need to figure out how to extract that expertise. So Qinwei Xia, Chihim Wang, and I are not experts by any means in biomedicine. We were very fortunate in getting Informa to allow us to use their data. So we mined their data, something like 175,000 different clinical trial events across 16,000 compounds and about 6,000 different trial sponsors. So as with many data science experiments, the key is having a large amount of data and being able to identify patterns. What the Novartis challenge taught us is that if you couple that with deep scientific expertise, amazing things can happen. And I'm not privy to the internal data that Novartis used, but when combined with the commercial data that was available, it came up with some really substantial insights. And so I wouldn't be surprised if over the course of the next few months or years, you're going to see those techniques turn into real drugs. We've already had a number of bioinformatics companies identify drug candidates using AI techniques. So I think that what we're hoping to do with that research is to allow other companies to figure out ways to collaborate with academia, often called pre-competitive, but I'm even thinking that during the competitive process, there are ways that we can share information without giving up our proprietary intellectual property. So for us, the lesson is that this is just the beginning. We're just in the first innings of applying data science more broadly to drug development and clinical trial outcome prediction. And the hope is that you'll get more and more biopharma companies willing to come to the table and work with us in academia to be able to put together these challenges more broadly defined.
Thank you. Kevin is asking, just read The Adaptive Market second time recently. Brilliant book. How do you think the market in biotech pharma is adapting with COVID-19?
Well, that's a great illustration of the adaptive markets hypothesis. For those who haven't read the book, I'm sure there are only a very few numbers that are in that category. The adaptive markets hypothesis is my pet theory for how financial market dynamics evolve. It's not necessarily always efficient, but it is highly competitive and it is adaptive to changing market conditions. What we've seen over the last few months in the midst of this COVID pandemic is that biopharma companies have adapted incredibly rapidly. To give you one example, let's take a look at vaccines. So prior to COVID-19, I and other co-authors have been writing about the fact that there really isn't enough money and attention devoted to infectious diseases and vaccines, both antivirals, anti-infectives, and vaccines. And for years now, a number of big pharma companies have been getting out of the vaccine space simply because the economic returns are just not there. And part of the reason they're not there is that people don't want to pay for vaccines in the same way that they don't really like paying for insurance. Why pay for something that you don't need right now? Whereas if you've got cancer, you definitely need it. And we all know people that have cancer, so nobody has a problem paying $100,000 for a cancer drug. But are we willing to pay even more than $1,000 for an inoculation? Right now, maybe, but not 6 months ago. And so what has happened in the industry and among various different stakeholder groups is that the presence of this pandemic has really changed people's perspectives about the importance of dealing with infectious diseases and how to go about developing vaccines. So clearly companies like Moderna, BioNTech, and others are really changing the way we think about vaccine development. But more importantly, I think that governments are now thinking differently about what they're willing to pay for vaccines. So I would say that the entire space, the entire ecosystem of infectious diseases has adapted over the course of the last 6 months. And if, as we all hope, we do get an approved vaccine by year end, that will be an extraordinary accomplishment of humankind, because in the past, it has taken literally multiple years to come up with a vaccine that is FDA approved. And this has just been an extraordinary development in science that will allow us to do it if we're able to achieve it by year end.
Thank you, Andrew. And along those lines, there's a follow-up question that says, if the government's providing billions of funds for that vaccine development and expediting the approval process, should the vaccine then be free for the taxpayers?
Well, that's actually a really important question. And the answer, not surprisingly, is complicated because it depends on how much money was invested in the vaccine in advance. So it's not just the billions of dollars that the government has provided so far. And frankly, I think the government should have provided even more money than that and earlier to be able to develop the infrastructure. But the question is, if the government does and could easily say, you know what, we think the vaccine should be given to everybody for free, well, that means that in the future, you may not be able to get other private sector companies to put up private capital to develop those vaccines. It all depends on the rate of return. Now that may not necessarily be a bad outcome. In other words, we may feel that vaccines are so important that we should not allow companies to charge whatever the market will bear, because whatever that number is, it'll be viewed as price gouging. If that's the case, then essentially what we want is for government to treat vaccines the way we treat other utilities, like electricity. Electric companies do not get to charge whatever the market will bear for electricity. Otherwise, you'd find yourself paying a heck of a lot more during the summertime for air conditioning than you do now. And it's because we've decided years ago that electricity is so important to daily life that we're going to regulate not only how it gets produced, but how much it gets charged and how much utilities can earn every year. So literally every year, the government decides what electricity rates, what natural gas rates, what home heating oil is going to cost. And that's a decision that was made by all the relevant stakeholders because we felt that was so important. The same might be true of vaccines. And if that is, then the government really has to step up and invest many tens of billions of dollars to be able to build the infrastructure and make it into a universal right, as opposed to a privilege that only those who can afford it can get access to. So really important issue, good question, and I'm hoping that we're going to have that discussion among all of the relevant policymakers and stakeholders once we've dealt with this pandemic.
Yeah, really great points. Thank you for that. And we are at the end of the time. Andrew, we really appreciate your time and your intriguing work and insights. Thank you so much. This has been great. And hopefully all of us will go out there and read Adaptive Markets if we haven't already.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure and an honor to be here and to speak with all of the other distinguished guests in this conference. And I want to give a special shout out to my former students, many of whom are in the Northern California area. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And we encourage everyone to join our Slack channel for further conversations with our speakers and attendees, and for basically to stick around for the next session. We'll see